Welcome to another book review, and today I'll be reviewing The Wind from the Sun by Arthur C. Clarke. And I got to tell you, I'm really glad that I read this novel. It really kind of reminded me why I loved classic science fiction so much growing up. I was a big fan of Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, the old Simpsons joke, the ABCs of science fiction, although Martin Prince thought that Bester was better than Bradbury. I disagree on that. But anyway, I loved this stuff, and it kind of ostracized me that I read this stuff because everyone else my age was reading Harry Potter and things like that, whatever else was popular at the time to read among the kids who actually did read. And I insisted on reading these kind of out of date science fiction novels from guys who were either already really old at the time or dead. But I loved them, and this was just reading this was like being reunited with an old friend. And it was written, of course, by the most famous resident of Sri Lanka, Arthur C. Clarke, who died, I believe, in 2008, either 2008 or 2009, at the age of 90. I kind of think of him as the king of classic science fiction, and I also think of him as the king of hard science fiction, because that's what he was, because he was a scientist, he was an engineer. So he didn't write anything that he didn't think was theoretically possible based on the science that was known at the time. That's what hard science fiction is, whereas, soft sci-fi or science fantasy, borderline fantasy, that's when you kind of get a little bit more poetic with things. Although maybe poetic's not the right term, because Arthur C. Clarke gets really poetic in his stories. He kind of had the same knack for doing that someone like Carl Sagan had, where he can take these very analytical, logical principles, but express them in such a beautiful, poetic way. He really had a knack for that. And he had his own TV show, Arthur C. Clarke Presents. And he was I think that he could have been a Carl Sagan type figure if he had done more of that kind of thing, television-wise. But he was a good kind of science communicator, particularly in his books. But yeah, he started writing. I think some of his earliest stories may date to the late 30s. I'm not sure. Certainly the 40s would be a lot of his earlier stuff was in the 40s. And then this novel was kind of him at his peak. This was him. Some of his short stories from the 1960s and 70s, which, in my opinion, was when he was at the height of his powers. And they range from 1 page to 40 pages. The last story, which is the meeting with Medusa, that one's 40 pages, and it's almost a novella. But then there's one that's just 1 page, and that one's called The Shortest Science Fiction Story Ever Told, or something like that. And it's kind of a joke story. And a couple of these stories kind of read like jokes, like the shorter ones, the ones that are like 1 to 3 pages. He has a really cool one called Dial F for Frankenstein that he wrote in the early 60s, which is about the telephone system becoming self-aware and basically taking over the world. Now, keep in mind, that was 20 years before Skynet and Terminator. He was writing about a similar concept way back in the early 60s, which is really cool. I mean, the guy, this is a different novel, but in Imperial Earth, he basically predicts smartphones. He predicts that everyone will have a mini computer in their pocket that can basically do anything, which is essentially a smartphone. So he truly was a visionary, and he's also credited with inventing the concept of the artificial satellite. He never built one, but he kind of came up with the concept and kind of came up with some rudimentary designs of, like, if you were going to send a radio transmitter into space, this is kind of how you would have to do it and what it would be like. And I'm sure he's not the only person who was thinking that at the time, but he's one of the people who kind of published that stuff, and he's kind of credited with coming up with that idea. And I really respect his work. I feel it's kind of a shame that a lot of the classic sci-fi from the, particularly the 60s and 70s, was not adapted into films and television later on. I wouldn't want them to do it now because they would ruin it, because of what Hollywood is like now. But in like the 90s and 20-aughts, if they could have gone back and to a lot of this source material and made true adaptations, that's the key. They'd have to be true to the original source material. But if they could have adapted a lot of these stories, and when I say true to the story, I don't mean just like in terms of feel, in terms of like the plot and everything. I mean in terms of the technology and everything else. Like, I would want them to be retrofuturistic. You know, I would want them to be as Clarke or someone of the time would have envisioned them, because I think that makes them a lot more interesting. I think that retrofuturism is the most interesting science fiction, frankly, and that's one reason why I like a lot of this classic sci-fi, is because it's kind of like science fiction that became retrofuturistic with time, once it sort of passed after the date of that a lot of this was predicted, or past the date where we knew that the future was not going to happen as these people thought. The stories in this take place in the future, the late 20th century and 21st century, which future of the time, kind of within a range of, like, I would say from like a few years to 150 years in the future of the time. And I have to say, this book actually kind of reads like a Black Mirror of its time. And I guess that kind of goes along with my what I said about how it would have made this would have made a good TV anthology, like a good TV show or a movie anthology. You know, anything adapted to the screen, as long as it was done well, it could have been really cool. And I'm glad that that's probably never going to happen, because, like I said, they would ruin it now. But if they had done that back in the 90s, it would have been a treasure trove, and it would have created some real masterpieces, I think. But yeah, it's kind of like Black Mirror, because in its feel, because maybe part of that is that Arthur C. Clarke was British. At least I believe he was British. Maybe some of that cultural feel kind of shows through in his writing. A lot of these stories are about people in some kind of trouble, usually one individual who gets himself into some kind of trouble and has to find a way out of it, and either does or doesn't. The last story is about a guy who's basically piloting a blimp in the Jupiter atmosphere, which is really cool. And just to give you an idea of like a sample of what's so cool about Arthur C. Clarke, is that he just adds these little factoids, kind of matter-of-factly, these little factoids in his stories. In that story, he mentioned that Falcon, who's the main character, he said that in the Jupiter atmosphere, there's thunder, because there are storms in the atmosphere all the time. But he said that because the atmosphere is full of hydrogen and helium, that the thunder would have falsetto overtones. Little points like that are just really cool, and they just kind of help keep you interested in the story. How he manages to sneak in these interesting little factoids about, like, if you went to Mars, or if you did this or did that, this is what it would really be like. So, and that's one thing I really appreciate about Clarke. When you look here, see, it gives you a sample. Space sailing, come ride with the sun's winds in space. Solar sails, he wrote a story about that. this is one of the more kind of joke stories. It's about like cannibalism. What if people? Maybe I shouldn't spoil it. Not that anyone necessarily watching this is going to read the book, but still. Among the planets, weather the hydrogen storms of Jupiter with Howard Falcon, once a man, now a cyborg, as he goes where no man has ever gone before. See, now if that doesn't sound cool, I don't know what does. And if that doesn't sound like a cool movie, or even like just an episode of The Outer Limits or something. But a lot of stories here. You see, that's how many. Roughly like, what, a dozen and a half. Those are the stories. I believe, and then The Wind from the Sun, the book is named after the story about wind sailing. It's actually an interplanetary race across the solar system in solar sails that were created by different companies in different countries. And I'd say I'm not a big fan of the artwork on here. I think that that's supposed to be a solar sail. It doesn't look. It looks weird. It looks like the inside of someone's blood vessel or something. It's that kind of blotchy, kind of almost impressionistic, 70s style impressionistic art that I'm not a big fan of. The font's kind of cool though. The font is definitely of its time. But and then of course they say by the author of 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is probably his best known work, which is one that I have not read. But anyway, and of course see it has the green badge of achievement there. But it's been a very long time since I've done a book review, so I wanted to get this one done. And yeah, this is the beginning of kind of a new string of my reading these kind of books, I think. Kind of going back to my roots and maybe making an actual dent in my classic sci-fi collection, because I really do love this stuff. And I think that that'll be the case no matter how out of date it becomes. There's just something about it that really gets to me. So anyway, thanks for watching. Make sure to like and comment and subscribe. Let me know what your favorite classic sci-fi author is, or anything you have to say about classic sci-fi. I'd love to hear about it and maybe get a good conversation going in the comments. But other than that, thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next video.